and our related work on transport equity. Next, we'll have Tom Cohen from the Active Travel Academy at the University of Westminster, and he'll give us his insights into his work on transport equity. He'll be followed by Millie Mitchell, a senior researcher at the Centre for London, who will talk to us about their work exploring policy ideas to change transport costs and encourage more walking, cycling, and use public or and using public or shared transport. Apologies, I have a weird echo somewhere. Is this affecting anyone else? And then after Millie, we'll have Alpa Mudarolu from Pedal My Wheels, who will tell us about Our Bike, a cargo bike share scheme for communities. He'll be joined by Eslam, who will share his experience as an Our Bike user. The last 20 minutes of our session will be for your questions. And for those of you who are here in person, please stay afterwards for light refreshments and use the opportunity to catch up with each other. One more thing, as this is a hybrid event, my colleague Isadora at the back of the room will be moderating the chat online, and my other colleague, Rothwave, will have a mic for people in the room. We'll share useful links in the chat and include them in our follow-up email. So for a bit of background, I'll start with what Cross River Partnership is and our work on transport equity. We are a public-private partnership delivering environmental, economic, and community-focused projects. We support our partners in addressing challenges around air quality, transport, placemaking, and well-being. Our vision is to address sustainability challenges collaboratively in London and beyond. As a testbed for exciting projects in towns and cities, we share knowledge, evidence, and best practice for the people who live and work and visit these places. So CRP Conversations is made possible through our Smarter, Greener Logistics program, which is funded by DEFRA and aims to improve air quality by reducing the impact of freight in London. The program is led by Westminster City Council in collaboration with 26 project partners. By addressing freight, we will improve noise, air quality, traffic, and the use of pavement space in London across 15 boroughs and 4 London business improvement districts. Smarter Greener Logistics forms part of CRP's wider activities to encourage sustainable logistics in London. This includes urban logistics hubs, curbside management, click and collect and parcel lockers, shared electric vehicle schemes and fleet electrification, cargo bike and walking freight deliveries, and supporting the logistics sector. The program runs until the end of next year. Over the years, we have worked to improve travel across London. This includes creating walkable spaces that align with TfL's Healthy Street Indicators, which was created by Lucy Saunders, to greening spaces, reducing traffic, and carrying out or commissioning useful research to address some of the challenges we've come across in our work. 2 years ago, we produced this report, Mobility, Justice and Transport Inclusivity, as part of our Healthy Streets Everyday program, which was funded by the Mayor's Air Quality Fund. Healthy Streets Everyday ran from 2019 to 2022 and aimed to transform our streets and enable walking and cycling. The report looked at mobility justice, inclusivity in UK's transport policy, the impacts of COVID-19 on mobility for the disabled, and included the stories of 5 individuals who faced multiple challenges getting around. Finally, it listed useful guidance documents with a brief description, which are useful for addressing some of these challenges. We also produced the lived experience of our streets, which came out of our work with the Central London Sub-Regional Transport Partnership. The partnership, which has been going for almost 15 years, enables collaboration and information sharing between partner boroughs on key sub-regional transport priorities. The report itself reimagines the function of streets, how people move, share, pick up, drop off, shop, explore, work, and play. It includes first-hand user accounts about challenges they face in these public spaces and what can be done to put people first in their design to improve accessibility, functionality, social interaction, and community resilience. We'll be sharing links to both of these reports so you can read them at your leisure. And now to our speakers. I would like to introduce Dr. Tom Cohen from the Active Travel Academy, and I'll let him talk a bit about himself and his work. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Safina. Very nice to be here. For the benefit of those who are joining online and who don't have a picture of me, I can confirm I look just like an academic would. So I'm here essentially as the warm-up guy. I have some general thoughts about transport justice, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues who have more specific and perhaps more interesting things to share. I will just say a word about the Active Travel Academy. That's not the principal reason why I'm here. I have a particular interest in transport justice, which goes beyond active travel. But yes, I am part of the Active Travel Academy at Westminster. And as you might imagine, we specialise in all things walking, wheeling and cycling and any other form of active travel that we might choose to name. That's a separate conversation, perhaps for drinks after. So, introductory thoughts. This is some research I did years ago, and it derives from the National Travel Survey, which is conducted by the Department for Transport, and it divides the nation into 20 so-called wealth semi-deciles or income semi-deciles. So the richest people are on the right-hand side and the poorest people on the left-hand side. And what they're spending to travel a mile, as you can see, has a pattern associated with wealth. It goes a little bit up. There's a bit of a kink on the left-hand side, which might reflect the poorest people relying on expensive buses, but the pattern is probably as you would expect. If you then normalize that for people's income, i.e. not simply the absolute cost of making a mile's journey, but what it means in terms of people's disposable income, there's a very pronounced change in pattern. And as you can see, the poorest 5% are spending more than twice as much in real terms to travel a mile than the next group along. And so it continues. There is nothing surprising in these numbers. I'm sure that you would have figured this out for yourselves, but I find it very useful to see it in such a stark way. And then the bit which is perhaps slightly less obvious, but if you think about it, not so surprising, is that the poorer people are traveling more slowly on average. So this is again traveling a mile, but how long it takes. And the people on the left-hand side are taking significantly longer to go a mile than the people on the right. You might say, no surprise, is that a big deal? Well, it is, and this is data from 2003. Yes, the Social Exclusion Unit's report Making the Connections, which some of you may remember from when it was published, 20 years old, and still, I think, having an impact. This is work that they were reproducing actually from others, and it shows that if you can get to a cheap supermarket, you can buy your products for an awful lot less money. So on top of the fact that it costs more to travel a certain distance, you may find that you can only get to relatively expensive shops because of those limitations to your transport. I imagine that the prices displayed on this graph will have changed dramatically since 2003, but I imagine that the pattern is very much as it was. So for me, at least, when I think about transport justice, I am particularly preoccupied with this term accessibility. That's at the top of the chart, and I hope that you can be convinced that that's really what should be our priority. And that means that I'm concentrating on a particular interpretation of justice or equity, what I would call distributional justice. Who gets what? And in transport terms, who can get to where with what level of ease? And the reason why I've put all of those other attributes beneath on the slide is to emphasize to us all that accessibility is a highly complex issue. Yes, you've got the simple things of where people are and where are the things or the people that they want to get to. And then you've got the facts of the transport system. What are the services? What do they cost? When do they run? Are they wheelchair accessible and so forth? But then you've got this complex web of people's characteristics. So to give you an example, religion and socioeconomic status, the term that we use, and I can assure you that academics never miss an opportunity to come up with jargon, we talk of intersectionality. So things that interact to create more complexity than would otherwise be the case. Here, imagine a Muslim man who is dependent on the bus because he doesn't have the access to a car, but he doesn't feel safe on the bus. There you might have religion and socioeconomic status interacting to reduce his accessibility. Gender and ethnicity are also often found in combination. So imagine a woman of color who has experienced harassment in a town center and then feels, as a result, unsafe walking there. And so it goes on, hence the etc. There are lots more interactions. Some of them are extremely well understood, like we know that disability is very strongly correlated with low income. So people whose transport choices might generally cost more may also be in a situation of having less money to spend on transport. Okay, why does it matter? Well, I think it matters because we should all find justice annoying at the very least and distressing. I'll settle for you're being disquieted by justice. I won't ask for more than that, but I think that we all should feel that justice is something, and if I've said justice when I meant injustice, please forgive me. We should all be upset by injustice when we encounter it. So there's that kind of what I would call normative reaction to something which is wrong in society. But there's something more pragmatic about this, which is that when people are excluded because of transport, social exclusion deriving from transport, then there's a missed opportunity. They are unable to contribute as fully to society as they might wish to, and we will face costs as a result. Social exclusion, as we know, is a very expensive problem to deal with societally. So there's that missed opportunity and there's that avoidable cost associated with, well, I'll use the term transport-related social exclusion because that's a term that's become quite common now. Now, as to what you might do about it, well, I have a very simple suggestion, and that is that we can go through a very simple process of first trying to understand what's going on. That doesn't necessarily mean gathering lots of data. It might help to do so, but there's quite a lot of data in the public domain which will help us to understand who is excluded and why. And then setting goals, because, well, I've been saying this for so long that I've become quite dull on the subject. We need to know where we're trying to get to if we're going to have any chance of getting there. Then we work out what we might do and try to pick projects or policies that might get us to our goals based on the understanding that we have. And finally, I'm an academic, so you'd expect me to recommend evaluating afterwards. Did it work? It's always worth wondering whether it worked. We really ought to know. Now, at this point, you are all, I'm sure, thinking, but Tom, wouldn't it be great if there were a pithy document that set out how to do this and provided some useful guidance and sources? Well, as it happens, I can help. We did a piece of work last year which resulted in this report. It's short, it's hopefully very accessible, and it has some practical guidance in it. And thanks to the miracle of the internet, there is a QR code, and I believe that our friends are going to be circulating a link on the chat. So I do urge you to have a look at that, and hopefully it will be of some use to you. If you wish to pursue this further, we are available to talk and would be very keen to engage with you concerning possibly supporting local authorities as they try to tackle this. It's something that we've done to a degree already. I have a closing thought, which is, of course, whilst I might be preoccupied with transport justice, it's hardly the only thing we're grappling with, and decarbonisation of the transport system is a huge priority too. One thing that I urge us all to think about is not to make things worse in our pursuit of transport decarbonisation. And this image from Living Streets, I think, speaks volumes. A charging unit which has made it more difficult to pass along the footway and probably made it impossible to pass in a wheelchair. So by all means, let's provide for the electric vehicle. It seems that we have concluded that it's an essential part of decarbonisation. Fine, but let's, for whatever we do, not make things worse for other people as part of that process. I'm done. I hope that I have radicalised and annoyed you enough that you are pumped up for the following speakers. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tom. So next we have Millie Mitchell. She's from Centre for London. And so, yeah, Millie, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Millie. I'm a senior researcher at the Centre for London. And for those of you that don't know us, the Centre for London is the capital's dedicated think tank, is how we like to describe ourselves. And kind of what we do, everything we do is all about trying to better understand the city that we live in and understand its challenges, and then trying to come up with policy solutions to solve it. So one of the projects that I'm going to talk to you about today was all about transport equity, and well, it was about financial incentives and how we can encourage behaviour change by using cost as a policy lever. But today I'll be talking a little bit about how we look at that through a transport equity lens, how we approach that throughout the research. So hopefully you come away knowing a little bit more about what the research recommends, but also about how as policymakers we can be thinking through the lens of equity when we're evaluating potential policies. So firstly, kind of what's the reason why we need this change? I'm sure many of you in the room will be very familiar with this, but transport accounts for around a quarter of London's carbon emissions. The vast majority of that is road transport. And yet, despite that, road transport still makes up the largest single proportion of daily trips in London every day. And so we have this kind of real need to try and change some behaviours. And the Mayor's got targets around 80% of journeys being made by active and sustainable travel by 2041, and we've still got a little bit of a way to go towards that. But when, as policymakers, we think about how do we actually change behaviours, it's all very easy to say we want these behaviours to change. How do we do it? There's all sorts of things that influence people's travel behaviours, and this is not an exhaustive list. So things like the travel environment, is there a bus stop at the end of the road? How safe is the cycle lanes around you? How attractive is the walking environment? All play a part in when you decide how to travel. Personal capabilities and needs is also very important. How able are you to use certain modes of transport? Are they all accessible to you? What do you need to do and achieve with your journey? We've got things like attitudes, which are very complex and very difficult for policymakers to understand. Do you consider yourself as a driver and that's sort of just part of your identity? Or similarly, do you consider yourself as a cyclist? And of course, you're going to cycle everywhere and you won't think twice when you're making that decision. I'd like to see more people think of themselves as a bus user, but we don't tend to see that one quite so much. And then we've got habits. Sometimes people aren't even making a decision when they're deciding how to make a journey. It's kind of just because they've always done it that way. And so even if we've changed the travel environment around them, perhaps they're not having that moment. And then finally, we've got affordability. And that's kind of what this specific research project was interested in how we can use cost as a tool for behaviour change. So what do we mean by financial incentives? So in a nutshell, we can encourage sustainable behaviours by making them cheaper. So for example, the Cycle to Work scheme or discounted bus fares. And we can also discourage unsustainable behaviours by making them more expensive. We all know about the ULEZ and the congestion charge, but there's other ways of doing this too. So who can do this? Who can influence transport costs? Like I said, we often think about Transport for London. We think about ULEZ and congestion charge and things like this. And they definitely have got a lot of levers that they can pull. But national government also has a lot of levers that impact transport costs. Some of these they use for behaviour change. Some of them they don't. Fuel duty effects, how much it costs to drive. I don't think the current government is trying to use that to disincentivise people from driving, given it's been frozen for quite a while. But local authorities also have sort of tools in their wheelhouse as well for affecting this. But it's not just policymakers that influence transport costs. There's all sorts of household characteristics, individual characteristics, and journey characteristics that go into answering this question of how much does it cost to travel in London. So when we're approaching this from kind of a policy analysis, it's really difficult to try and capture all of these. So what did we do with this research project? We know that we wanted to test a whole range of different policies, but we knew that we can't just have one answer. So we used some work that Transport for London did, where they, in 2017, where they classified 9 different sort of kinds of travellers in London. And this was based on like a whole bunch of surveying. And from that, we've developed out 9 kind of typical families or individuals in London. And this doesn't represent everyone, right? It's not going to be able to do that, but it does represent some of the kinds of journeys. So for each of these people, we had people that we considered on low income, middle income, high income, people that were travelling for work, people that were travelling for leisure, people that were travelling for school. We looked at people that were travelling in inner London, into inner London, outer into inner, and also outer London and just travelling just within outer London, not coming into inner London at all. And what we tried to do with this is we then modelled what would it cost each of these 9 typical Londoners to make their given journey under current conditions. So how much would it cost them to drive? How much would it cost them to cycle? How much would it cost them to take public transport? And then we tested a whole range of different policies on them to see who are the winners and who are the losers, and is that kind of a fair and equitable outcome? So what does a good financial incentive look like? This was kind of what we were trying to look for when we were doing that testing. So firstly, ideally it's targeted, so it's actually impacting those people whose behaviours you're actually trying to change. That it's fair, and in this sense we were kind of thinking through the lens of not disproportionately financially impacting those with the least ability to pay, or disproportionately rewarding those who already have the most ability to pay. Ideally, there's available alternatives. You know, if you're going to introduce an increased cost on something, then ideally there would be some other options for people to do that. So the way we looked at that in the model was around, you know, was the journeys that we're looking at cyclable? So if they weren't cyclable, there's no point us comparing the cost to cycle that journey if it's perhaps far too far or for other reasons. And then finally, there's a point around messaging, but I'll come to that later. So I've got two very quick examples of what the model churned out. There are lots, many more in the reports, which I'd urge you to go and read. So this is an example of if we were to introduce a £1 bus fare, who would it impact? Well, unsurprisingly, it impacted those Londoners who were taking the bus to take their journey. And some of the people that were most impacted were people on low incomes, because they were most likely to be using buses to take that journey. But interestingly, you know, for one of the households that we looked at, for Peter, Zara and their children, although this might make cost savings, for them it was still cheaper to drive. So realistically, is this likely to lead to the behaviour change that we want? You know, it's hard to tell. A slightly more complicated policy that we tried to test was distance and emissions-based road user charging. And this is something that we at Centre for London have been sort of advocating for quite some time. So that's replacing congestion charging ULEZ with a more dynamic road user charging model. And don't get too sucked into the individual numbers on here because, you know, it's quite complicated. But what we can see is that for some people, this made their travelling more expensive. But for others, it actually made those specific journeys cheaper. And that could actually be a much fairer way of charging rather than this kind of flat rate charging that we currently see. But what's important we took away from this was that if you're going to make some of those journeys cheaper, there still needs to be that incentive to travel sustainably. So we don't want to accidentally incentivize short trips being made by car because you've got a very low emission car and it actually is cheaper than taking the bus, for example. So there's sort of something to consider there. But that's not the only kind of lens for which we're looking at equity in this project. We also think that by packaging policies together, we can also increase transport fairness. So using that push and pull framework to design new policies. So great example being the ULEZ scrappage scheme and support offers, which were being introduced at the same time as ULEZ expansions. Though I would say that there's a lot to be said about kind of communication about how we can raise awareness so people actually know those offers are out there for them to use it. Before the scrappage scheme was extended to be eligible for all Londoners, there were also all these support offers, they still exist, right, that any Londoner was able to use. I don't know how many people actually knew that they were out there and available to them. But it's not just, again, TfL that can policy package, so too can local authorities. So if a local authority is introducing emissions graded car parking, why not at the same time reduce the costs of secure bike parking within the borough? So there's that really clear message to people about what kind of behaviours that you want to encourage, and you're not just financially disincentivizing, but also incentivizing at the same time. So some overarching recommendations. The report has got many, but I've just picked out a few for you here today. The first being that it'd be good to make it easier for people to know the overall costs of driving relative to other modes of transport. So as part of this modelling, we had to try and calculate that overall cost of driving, right? And there's so many different things that go into it, from the cost of the car to your insurance, to your fuel, to your parking permit, etc. And frankly, most people don't know how much it's currently costing them to drive. And if we can kind of make people more aware of that, then perhaps they could actually save money by driving less, but they don't think about it like that at the moment. The second point being to communicate in advance about any new policy measures like this that are being introduced. People's household finances don't change overnight. You know, if you're introducing a new measure, they need to have time to adapt to that coming in and to know to kind of change their behaviours in advance. If you have a car, you're not going to suddenly get rid of your car. Those things take time. So it's all about how we communicate with people so they're most well prepared to make those behaviour changes that we're asking them to. And then, yeah, finally, packaging measures together with those push and pull. And we've got quite a few in the report that you can take a look at. I won't go through this. There's many more. But yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Millie. So next we have Alpa Mudarolu and Eslam from Pedal My Wheel /RBike, and they'll be telling us about their program. And yeah.
Hello, everyone. Esmond's going to join me. Excuse my voice. Thanks to Millie and Tom. That was great. So I'm going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour through Pedal My Wheels and Our Bike schemes that we run. So before I start, I guess the reason it's relative to today's talk, everything we do is aimed at, I guess, the sort of 95% who don't cycle regularly. And the main barriers we've always found are affordability and fear of riding on the road, or that I'm not the person, that isn't me, a cyclist. So I'll sort of focus more on the affordability. But yeah, this is us. This is how we started. I started the company back in 2014 with pop-up secondhand bike markets, which we still run today. And our Try Before You Bike scheme, which now runs in 24 London boroughs, that started in 2017. Our Bike, which we run some of those in partnership with Cross River Partnership, started last year, and a new scheme called Community Influencers. So Try Before You Bike. So Try Before You Bike, it's now in 24 London boroughs, as I said. It's a subscription model cycling scheme, and it was designed, I guess, influenced by the existing sort of loan schemes that were around at the time. And the idea being an accessible route to cycling. So you haven't got to go and buy a bike if you can't afford it, or if you're not sure that you're going to use a bike. You order through us online with Try Before You Bike. The bike gets delivered to your door. So things like this were important characteristics of it. The schemes that we'd looked at, you had to go to an actual designated venue to pick up the bike. Now, a lot of the people we'd been talking to who we were designing Try Before You Bike for, because they hadn't cycled for many years, they wouldn't go travel 3 miles to a location in their borough, get a bike, and then they'd have to get it back somehow. So the delivery to the door part is quite important. Upon delivery, not with every borough, but a lot of our councils, they fund us to deliver a training session upon delivery of the bike. So our staff are qualified cycle instructors. They will deliver up to 2 hours of cycle training with the bike. So the point of it is, we don't want that person to try a bike out, just leave them with it, and then, you know, if anything goes wrong, it's a Try Before You Bike scheme. They could easily tick off they've tried it and then return the bike to us. So it's sort of flexible, supportive. We signpost other council initiatives such as storage, further cycle training, stuff like that. And in terms of affordability, in some cases, councils will fund that free trial. So for the end user, it's free. Some boroughs, that isn't the case. They pay, the end user pays for it. But each time they pay a monthly fee for the bike, they will get that deducted from the price if they choose to buy it. And then the purchase options for the user are the Cycle to Work scheme, interest-free monthly payments over 12 months, or if they're fortunate enough, a one-off payment. So it sort of covers as many bases as we can on it. That's a nice stat. So this is some of the stuff we surveyed 1,400 of our users. We got some postcode demographic information and cross-reference that against the deprivation index, and a large proportion, 77%, was from lower to middle income households. Majority used by women. 65% overall buy a bike from the scheme, and 60% are non-white British. So it's a mixed use. This is the sort of feedback we get, which we share with councils. I'm going to move along a bit because I've got other. So influencers, community influencers. This is a scheme that we were fortunate enough to start last year in Lambeth. Basically, the idea behind it is, rather than Pedal My Wheels, a bike company, or in this case, the first one, Lambeth Council's Sustainable Transport, telling people that cycling's great, you should jump on a bike, and, you know, we would say that we're a bike company. We get people from those communities to show people and talk to people within that community about cycling. It's a 12-month program. Each influencer, if they follow the program all the way through, will get their bike at the end of it. We deliver training sessions as many as they need to get confident on the road. And it's sort of taken on a bit of a life of its own. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a totally original idea from us. I've borrowed largely from very successful organisations like Joyriders, Cycle System, like proven schemes, and it works. They have a lot more impact. The stuff we get back from influencers, the stories, both why they didn't cycle before and once they are starting, are way more impactful than anything we could come up with, or no disrespect to councils, but probably councils' comms teams could come up with, because it's actually people like the communities they're in. It's been really successful. We did the first year last year with Lambeth. We had 30 influencers. This lot are the next 30 for Lambeth. Southwark have got 20 odd influencers, and Brent have started a program as well. And this is the sort of feedback we get. Excuse me. They'll also come to events, influencers. So it might be a council event, could be something like this. Eslam's not an influencer, but he's part of our bikes, which we'll get onto in a second. And the more we bring people in who are actually using our schemes, the better it is for us. Not only do they sort of influence how we run our schemes, but like I said, it has more impact for other people within their communities. Second-hand bike markets, I'll run through quickly. This is how I started. I just noticed Ben at the back there. He was the first person to book me for a bike market in Camden back in 2015. There are pop-up bike markets. People bring their unwanted, unused, outgrown bikes. They leave them with us. We service them. We sell them at affordable prices. And now the model is the revenue from the bikes that are sold will go to a local charity or community group within that borough. So in Lambeth, it's Upcycle, Cycle Sisters. In Southwark, I can't remember all the charities now. But so it's not only, fundamentally, it's there to create affordable bike stock. It's also recycling, and it's also creating funds for local charities. And finally, Our Bike. So Our Bike, and we've run some of these bikes in partnership with Cross River Partnership and local councils. It came about through various cargo bike schemes we run, some of it through Try Before You Bike. A lot of the funding for cargo bikes we've noticed in the last few years has been focused on business use of cargo bikes, which we're not against. It's not our speciality, but we were involved in some schemes where it involved a cargo bike or cargo bikes going out in certain high streets, and then you try and encourage local retailers to use these bikes, and you sort of walk up and down the high street. Half of them don't know what a cargo bike is. They're a destination. They don't want to use a cargo bike. They don't need to use a cargo bike. So we were sort of trying to come up with something that could engage with those businesses still, but not waste the funds and not waste the cargo bike, which is where the shared scheme came, because this is a bike that gets left out on the street 24/7. It's much like a car club or zip car or something like that. It's left out there 24/7. It's partnered with a local business who will host the bike. So they manage the batteries on it. They can use it for free themselves. They get some sponsorship on the cargo box. And other people within that area can use the bike. So it's you download the Our Bike app, and then you can reserve it, pay through the app. It's the first 60 minutes you use is free, and then it's £3 an hour, and you can reserve it by the 15-minute segment. It came about partly from what I said, and also the two big barriers for cargo bike use are affordability. I mean, electric cargo bikes, our lowest price one for Try Before You Bike is, I think, now £3,200, but more average, it will be nearer £5,000, which is out of the reach for a lot of people. It's also not a vehicle that people necessarily need to own unless you're maybe doing the school run every day. But people use Our Bike for certain jobs, or like going to the allotment, say, like one-off type jobs, or if it's a business moving stock between stores, stuff like that. You don't necessarily need to own one for that. And if you do, this is a good way of finding out. So it's like a gateway. Some of our businesses who've used it have then gone on to buy their own cargo bike. Right, I'll skip through. See some of the stats we get back. So you can see the main usage, it is more residents using it than business, but we do get business use. I think the important figure here is the what it replaces our bike. So as you can see, petrol car 31%, car diesel 10%, motorized vehicles sort of takes over 50%. That's what our users tell us. 45% quoted affordability as to why they couldn't get a cargo bike. And then just some other stuff around age, price wise. So it's subsidized by the council. So that's why the fee is £3 an hour. It's sort of getting close, just under the Santander. Obviously, other things are going to be different. I can see Pedal Me, but obviously they do a totally different thing. It's a service. But if you look at the Lime bikes, for example, and then zip cars, around about £10 for a zip van. And finally, we get to one of our users, Eslam. So rather than me speak about it, I'll let him share his experience. Is that right?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to share why I decided to get involved with our bike. I started a company. As mentioned earlier, affordability is a barrier. Sustainability is an extra. So I was in between those two realities. I wanted to be sustainable, but I also hope to have that achieved in affordable ways. In London, that's the most affordable cargo bike service. And the beauty of it is that you don't need to own the bike, especially if you are doing collections or if you are traveling a lot. Like I'm a nutritionist. I'm now focusing on waste management and transformation of waste management within circular economies. So I work with local businesses, community gardens, food banks, retailers, everywhere. So the idea is that sometimes I need to make a journey from A to B, but then I'm going from D to F. And by having different cargo bike allocated in different areas of the city is very strategic. It's very useful because very often it's going to be faster to have a bike than maybe a bit of a tube or something like a bus. So you can pick and choose what is the best way to travel according on your needs. Is convenient not only for businesses, but for individuals. I need to move house, I need to bring something heavy, anything. And you don't need the whole hour. You can do it in 15 minutes. So the idea is that, I'm not sure was mentioned, like you don't need to rent it for 1 hour. You need just heavy shopping. Go, done, bam, easy, sustainable, clean. The change in behavior comes automatically because once you understand how safe and practical it is, once you see other businesses and people moving in the same way, you say, if they can do it, I can do it. And that's how I started to have my community engage a bit more. We had one of the bikes allocated to one of the places in Blackstock Road. The reason was that they saw me doing it, they saw that feasible and was convenient for them. Not only give you the chance to have sponsorship of the bike, but your customers can also have these other extra tool to relate to you. So it's really a way and a tool to empower the communities, empower local businesses, connect them even further. And I think in the future, more of those bikes can be a huge resolution. Government is looking to have transport moved from van into cargo bike, 1-2% by 2030. Just by increasing the amount of little collection from here to there, that's feasible, is easily achievable. And if the cost is supported, you're going to have more people willing to do these changes, because as we were saying, the main barrier is affordability, especially those areas that are a bit more deprived. So hopefully you will support a bit more of all of the cargo bike initiatives, in particular our bike. And yes, thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much, Alper and Eslam. So I guess now we'll move on to questions and answers. So I will ask our speakers to please take the seats at the front of the room. Ross will be moving around with a mic. Isadora, do we have any questions online? Any questions for our speakers? Well, that was very thorough. So I can go ahead and start with a question for, I'll just go in order. The question for Tom.
Oh,
Ross, would you please? Thank you. So the first question I have here is, how did you measure impact from the workshop with local authorities? Did you follow up to see if they have implemented any of the principles?
I was counselling you to evaluate, and so we should have evaluated the workshop rather more thoroughly than we did. We did obviously seek feedback, and people said whether they found the workshop useful. We have produced literally the best catering that the University of Westminster can do, and so people were reasonably jubilant as they left. I think, in general, the message was that people found the event. So I should give a little bit more background, because I didn't say much about the workshop. The report that I showed you came out of a day that we spent with a number of people from local authorities who wanted to explore transport justice. And we designed the day quite carefully. We had some expert contributions, and then we did some discussion in groups of specific questions. And yeah, people went away and they filled in their feedback as they went. So there was plenty of feedback forms saying that was very thought-provoking. Thank you. It's definitely helped us to advance our thinking. And then we invited anyone who wished to continue the conversation. And that led to, if I'm completely honest, a number of promising but ultimately unproductive discussions with local authorities that were keen, but who really struggled to find the resource to continue the conversation alongside everything else that they've got to do. I don't need to tell the people in this room that it's tough out there in local government right now. So maybe what that demonstrates is that transport justice remains more of a nice to have than I think it should be. And perhaps the challenge for us who believe it to be really important is to convince everybody else that it is as important as we claim.
Thank you.
Do I get a mark for that?
2 out of 2?
2 out of 2.
Thank you. So my next question is for Millie. Have you engaged with local authorities or the GLA on your recommendations, and what's their reception been? Do you think there are any blockers in terms of implementing your recommendations?
Yeah, so for our project, that we do engage with the company stakeholders as we're carrying it out. I would say there's kind of 2 main blockers that come out when it comes to this thing. One is that on the theme of equity, introducing a financial disincentive is a politically challenging thing to do, right? It's going to have lots of people who will come forward, especially to represent their local councillors, saying that it's going to impact them in a way that doesn't feel fair. So in order to introduce it fairly and for local authorities, especially to feel able to do that, they need to have that strong political will. They need to feel that there is a strong enough case. That can come back to what I was saying before about packaging disincentives with incentives. If you can turn back around to residents and say, look, I know that parking your car on your street is going to cost you a bit more because we're introducing emissions-graded parking permits, but we're doing X, Y, and Z that's going to help other forms of travel be cheaper. Then you can build that political will back in. But the second thing is also kind of their own costs. So kind of what someone's just saying about resources that are available. We came across in the research that many of you will be aware of about how expensive secure cycle parking can be in London. And for many Londoners, that is a real barrier for them being able to own and access their own bike, is having a safe and secure place to keep it. But in many local authorities, well, maybe if you are one person with one bike, it's cheaper to park your bike than it is to park your car. But if you're a family with, say, 2 or 3 children, it can actually be more expensive to park your bikes in your borough than it is to park your car on the street. So financially, this simply doesn't make sense. But when we sort of challenge local authorities on this, we talked about why that is the case. It is because installing safe and secure cycle helmets is a very expensive thing to do, and it's not just installing it, but it's also maintaining them in the future. So lots of that funding does come from Transport London. That funding should and increase and can increase and should be encouraged to. But until we can bring those costs down for local authorities, they can't then offer it out cheaper. You know, we really would love to see local authorities be able to offer low income households discounted rates for those parking permits, cycle parking places. But until they've kind of got the funding resources to be able to do that, it's simply not possible.
Thank you very much. Question at the back of the room.
This is for a question for Alpha. I'm just wondering what sort of demands you might have had from disabled people using adapted or accessible bikes, and whether you're able to meet that demand.
Yeah, so we have got an adaptive option on the Try Before You bike, which I'd say maybe a third of the councils who run that scheme have added in. The problem with it is it's a limited amount of funding. And if you think about the Try Before You bike model, it's like you try a bike, if it's not for you, you give it back, we service it, it goes back out to someone else. And that's what makes it sort of scalable and I guess cheaper for councils to use us. With an adaptive bike, they can be really expensive and you may well be making adaptations to it. So we end up with a sort of standard, like an electric trike. It's limited what we can offer. There was demand, definitely, especially during COVID. There's other more comprehensive adaptive schemes we're looking hopefully to launch next year, and it'll be more partnership with the more experts in this world, Wilson Wellbeing, that type of thing. So there's definitely a demand for it and a desire for it. It's just getting the model right. It needs something slightly different to our more standardized Try Before You bike model. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Isadora?
Yeah, we've got some questions in the chat online.
Yes, so we've got one question from Johanna, Senior Transport Planner at Camden Council. There's a question for Alpha. Are there instances of our bikes being hosted by a non-business entity, for example, a school or a community centre?
There aren't. Community centre, yes, actually, we have got one. When the idea first came to me, I wanted it to be more in local residential streets and community centres. A lot of the business focus has been a funding thing. I feel like probably the use of the scheme would be stronger if it were in, because you've already got that ready-made for local community and where we've got bikes, although they're with a local business, where they're surrounded by like an LTM, surrounded by residential areas, they're the ones that get used the most. So yes, we have done it. Mainly it's partnered with local business. We'd like to do more, definitely.
And then we've got a second question from Elliot from Rock Engineering. They're saying legislation currently requires a 250 watt power limit and pedal input. This is not really a viable setup for future micro-mobility or logistics. How do you see the legislation evolving to enable more suitable solutions to be offered? And your question for everyone.
Well, I wouldn't want to overstate my expertise in this regard, but there was talk of a transport bill that would address the issue of electric scooters, notably absent from the King's speech. It's clear that the government has no intention of acting on this anytime soon, and I suppose the general election might change that. But I think the questioner makes an interesting and valid point, and it's high time the subject was looked at properly.
Did I see a hand? Yes.
Hello, I'm Anthony. I'm a London Blue Badge tour guide focused on sustainable city. It's a question, I think, for Millie. You made a really interesting point about identity. I see myself as a driver. I see myself as a cyclist. And I just wonder, in terms of, I know we talked wider than just promoting active transport, but in terms of promoting active transport, how much of this is actually cultural? I mean, how can you change cycling culture so it's not purely perceived as sort of old white blokes like me dressed in lycra? I'm in tweed today, not in lycra, but how do you sort of shift the dial? And is it cultural? And how much of it is cultural? Is it a nudge factor? Where are you on that?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, actually. I think some of it is cultural, right? Some of it is some attitudes are quite ingrained, but I'm fairly optimistic that we shouldn't be kind of pessimistic. Well, I'm obviously we shouldn't be pessimistic that it's, oh, well, some people are just never going to want to do that because they don't see themselves that way. I think a lot of it is about a kind of increasing access, increasing visibility. I mean, if you look at kind of the gender statistics on cycling, you know, far more men cycle than women, we might say, oh, that's because men like wearing lycra and going out with their mates and cycling, but actually it's also to do with, you know, lots of women don't cycle because they don't feel safe cycling, and then that's sort of their main barrier. So if we can improve the kind of cycling infrastructure that's in place so that more women feel safe when out and about cycling, you see more women cycling, it becomes more accessible, and then create schemes like ours that allow people to try a different mode of transport than they usually would, with that kind of no pressure. You can stop, you can change your mind. I think that's kind of how we can get there. So it's about unpacking why do some people feel more or less able to or feel more or less like it's for them, and then how can we make that more accessible.
Thank you.
I may just add a thought to that. I agree with everything Millie just said. My impression, and I wonder what other people feel, is that when I look at line users in London, I'm seeing more diversity than I would expect, and maybe that's a sign of things moving in the right direction. The other thing I would say, something that we can all do as practitioners, is choose our language with care. To the extent that there's a culture war going on, then the best thing we can do is try to avoid the war, or try to tone things down. And we heard about Lucy Saunders earlier on, and I do admire her tendency to avoid ever using the word cyclist, or even the word walker. People cycling, people walking, because we are not our modes. We choose to use modes, and the majority of us use more than one. Although I could mention a student who says he never does anything but drive. So there are people who insist on seeing themselves through a particular lens, but I think we can try to avoid reinforcing that by choosing our words with care.
Hello, I'm Katie Dixon, also from Camden. I'm trying to word this as a question, but really it's more of a comment that I'm hoping you can contribute to. A lot of these schemes you have mentioned would come under a revenue budget, not a capital budget. I happen to know my council right now, there's a little bit of a pot of capital money that I can use, but revenue, incredibly difficult to get hold of. So it's really a question of, I know this is mainly about financial incentives outside, but my financial problem is inside of how to capitalise revenue schemes.
Mm.
I'll try and answer. Yeah, we've come up against that problem definitely. So some of the things we're trying to do, our bike as an example, the cargo share, we are working on new models with the hosts where it'd be a sort of, I guess, a franchise line. So possibly the asset is purchased by the council only, and that's it. There's nothing else there. They play no further part. That gets given to the local community group or a local business, and then we work on a shared revenue scheme. I don't know if that would fit in with would the capital expenditure on that fit in with what you just talked about? Because most of ours are mixed. There's some asset purchase, and then our bike, we have come up against that. So it's like, especially around cargo bikes, it's like we're going to buy, a council will buy X amount of cargo bikes, and that's it. It's just going to be there for someone to use. And our schemes involve further service costs. So we're trying to work out ways to cover that service cost, whether that's through hire fee, whether that's through sponsorship, whatever else. And the council's involvement will be the asset purchase. That's the best I can give, I think.
I certainly can't claim to understand the intricacies of local government finance, but I will offer a political view, and this bears out what we're hearing about the costs of hiring a space and a hangar versus the cost of having a parking permit. In my home borough of Islington, which in many respects is to be admired. I learned the other day that if you have a zero emission car, it costs you £100 to park for the year, whereas the space in a hangar costs, that's right, £106. So everything that's being said about the costs of putting in hangars and maintaining them is valid, but cross subsidy is something which we routinely do when there is a good case for one thing paying for something else. It's a social argument for doing that. And I should be lobbying my local council in a very positive and constructive way to have a think about whether they couldn't just change that around.
Just to jump on that, I think I absolutely agree with what you're saying. And it's also about having that joint up thinking within a local council about the sorts of things you're offering. You know, there should be a strategy that looks at those things together. It shouldn't just be, I came across this exact thing, sort of things where it's cheaper to park than it is to park one bike. And it just feels that there's a sort of mismatch going on where you could be having more conversation within a local authority about how do you use your parking kind of strategy. You know, if you've got emissions grading, that's great, but does it line up with the other activities you're doing? Are you sending out clear messages to residents, make it easy for them to make those sustainable choices or not?
Any more questions?
One more.
Yeah, I'll ask them.
Just Nick. Hi, I'm Simone Weisband from Transport for London. There was a question for Millie. I'm really interested. I mean, you have your 9, there's only so many representatives you can have, but obviously given the number of protected characteristics that we look at, and particularly the variation of that within the disability heading, for example, I wondered how you identified what the potential impacts would be on those groups that we need to look at from a public sector and quality duty perspective, and certainly the councils that you're dealing with will need to understand if there are any specific negative impacts. Did you manage to incorporate that and provide that information to the councils?
So yes and no. I think the modelling exercise we tried to do was very complicated, and I think hopefully that came across right, as it's not a straightforward thing to do. Within those personas that we looked at, we did consider which of those would be more or less likely to have certain protected characteristics according to the data that's out there. But it can't do everything, and you know, we could scale it up very much. We could create 10 more personas of similar and add in more of those. I think it's very complicated thing to have to work, and I think when you're assessing a policy, you can only assess so much. But in this, what we were looking at mostly was low income versus high income.
All right, well, first of all, thank you all for your really, really good questions, and thank you very much to the speakers for your presentations and for your really, really detailed answers to the questions that came your way. We are at the end of our hour, and we will send out follow-up resources over the next few days from this session. So for the last time this year, thank you. And for those of you in the room, please do stay, enjoy the refreshments provided in the back, and chat amongst yourselves for the next 30 minutes. Thank you again.